This week on the Drive podcast, Ford Ranger and Everest price rises. Two of Australia's most popular vehicles have gone up in price, and we'll break that down for you. Toyota RAV4 hybrid wait times. We know we've told you about it before and people are complaining, but calm down, everyone. You're not alone. Also, the rise of Chinese-made dual cab sales. Great Wall and LDV outselling Nissan Navara for the first 3 months this year. That's this week on the Drive podcast.
From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Thursday, May 4th. The coronation of King Charles III takes place in 2 days. Inevitably, the debate about whether Australia should become a republic is rearing its head. This is a conversation that's been happening in Australia for more than 30 years. But could we finally be on the precipice of change? Today, Craig Foster, former Socceroo and now co-chair of the Australian Republic movement, on why Australians may finally be ready to sever ties with the monarchy. So, Craig, on Saturday, King Charles III will officially be crowned. He'll hold the sovereign scepter, the golden rod with its whopping 530.2 carat diamond. That's meant to represent the monarch's power and governance. And for the first time, Australians and citizens of other Commonwealth nations, including our Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, will be invited to swear allegiance to the King and raise a chorus of millions of voices supporting their undoubted King, defender of all. So how does this make you feel? And what do you want to say to those Australians, and there are many, who love the pomp and ceremony of a coronation and who feel a great fondness for the monarchy as their parents and grandparents and perhaps even great-grandparents did before them?
Yeah, great. You know, we really needed, I think as a country, some of these moments to crystallise in Australia's minds, firstly, that we do have a foreign king as our head of state. And around a third of Australia, research says, still weren't quite aware of that. If they weren't, they certainly are now. And secondly, for Australia to start to think about the fact that it's very likely that the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, will actually, metaphorically, if not literally, take a knee to a foreign king who is still your head of state and pledge loyalty to him and his heirs and successors rather than to you and to I. And so it's really put on the table for Australians this whole notion of our democracy, and the fact that sovereignty of this country is not fully vested in us, the Australian people. It still rests in the Crown and it rests in King Charles. And the overwhelming majority of Australia, research very clearly says, believes that it's time to change that.
And is that why, I believe you've said that it's embarrassing that a 74-year-old Englishman is now the King of Australia. So why is that embarrassing? And do you think it's like Anthony Albanese being expected to grovel before a king, sort of the taking a knee? Is that the way you see it?
A pledge is factually a pledge of subservience. A pledge of loyalty and allegiance and fealty is a pledge to say that we are ruled by you. That's what Anthony Albanese is, as I understand it, has said that he is going to take. Now, he doesn't have to. He is a shrewd political operator, and for whatever reason, and we can all speculate on that, Anthony may feel that it's necessary for him to do so. But equally at the same time, he's clearly a Republican. You know, he's talking about a Republic referendum in the next term of government, should his party be elected. And therefore, it's a deeply uncomfortable situation, I think, for him, whilst he won't admit it, and for many, many Australians, including me. And it's really important that we feel that discomfort. That's the beauty of this week. We need to feel this contradiction between considering ourselves as a sovereign nation, a respected middle power, a democratic nation, and at the same time trying to be respectful, and that includes me and the Republican movement, trying to be respectful when we're seeing this 70-plus-year-old person, be ordained by the Archbishop of Canterbury, pretending that he somehow has a divine right, which is an historical, arcane kind of principle that this King Charles is ordained by God. That in itself is absolutely ridiculous. We're kind of in a moment where we know we want to move, and we had a referendum in 1999, that's a quarter of a century ago, and even then there was overwhelming support for a republic. So Australia 25 years ago were Republicans. It's just that there was a disagreement on the actual model. But the polling said that Australia wanted to move.
Right.
And that research is very similar today.
I guess what different model would you put forward now, and what was wrong with the model that was put forward in 1999 that it failed?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say what was wrong with it. What I'd say is what the Australian people felt or were convinced to believe about it was that it was in inverted commas, politicians' model, and that there wasn't a process whereby citizens could participate in having some form of election in their own head of state. And in 1999, there was a whole range of different views, even from within those who wanted to become a republic, or all of these various organisations. And even those organisations many of them decided, oh, we don't like this particular step, even though it was, to all practical intents and purposes, it was basically the same, even a little bit stronger than what we have now, whereby basically the Governor-General is appointed by the Prime Minister. One of the problems was that part of even those who would see themselves as Republicans decided that they would get, and they convinced the Australian people that they would get another chance very soon. I don't know on what basis they thought that was possible, but what they essentially said was, look, it's 99, we're not completely happy with this actual model, so we're encouraging you all, even though we want our Australian head of state, we're encouraging you all of Australia to vote no, because in another few years' time we'll have another go. Well, it's a quarter of a century. So that lesson has been learnt.
Well, I really want to get to your personal feelings on this. So most people who know you, and I'd say many, many Australians do, know you as a soccer champion, a sports broadcaster. So why do you care so much about Australia becoming a republic?
Well, in part because of that reason, and because I grew up with this conception. My family, in particular my mother, was a royalist. She loved Elizabeth, and she was part of that older generation of Australians who grew up with Elizabeth, and they were taught to see that, and by taught I mean this was the culture of Australia, and so she knew no different. Today we know different. Today we can contextualise the Crown and Elizabeth's reign and those before in a way that, the older generation of Australians didn't have that opportunity because that education was simply not there. First Nations were in a different place. Australia was culturally in a different place. People didn't ask questions. It was seen as heretical or radical. Today we talk about Invasion Day. Imagine doing that 30 years ago, right? Only First Nations were doing it, and that's the courage that they showed. So I grew up in that kind of construct of what Australia was. And then as I started to play for Australia, pulling on the jersey means that you get to contemplate deeply. I wouldn't say more deeply because, most Australians do so, but at least an opportunity to contemplate what it is that we actually are playing for. And we always talked about our values. And when people go to play for Australia, whether it's the coaches or the media or the fans, look, you are representing us. You're the embodiment of who we are. And you start to think, well, who are we? What is it that we're about? And then you start to look at, whether it's the anthem and the Union Jack and the concept of royalty. And that was always out of step with my view of Australian cultural and social values.
So when you began to think about that, well, what does it mean to be Australian? And did it make you feel embarrassed or ashamed that we had the monarch as the head of state?
Shame is not the right word. No, I felt uncomfortable. I felt deeply uncomfortable. And in my young playing years, I started to coach many First Nations young players, and I befriended their families. And so, probably 25, 30 years ago, I was becoming friends, lifelong friends with many First Nations families who were part of the stolen generations, for example. So, over many, many decades, I've walked this journey that now Australia is now going on, and we're all at different levels of it, which is why it's important we have these conversations to understand that actually this construct of royalty is completely out of step with who we see ourselves as. We are a country that is, I think, deeply committed to equality, to inclusion, to non-discrimination, as you saw, for example, in the wonderful same-sex marriage act and debate. And the royal family represents a whole range of things. Firstly, they're exclusionary by their very nature on a whole range of levels, whether it's by culture, nationality, gender, race and religion, pick any of the above. But they also are now recognised as being right at the centre, in fact, being responsible for terra nullius and what we now know as stolen land. And this lie at the heart of Australia, which says that essentially First Nations people didn't exist, had no culture, which was brought down and undressed, if you like, by the High Court in Mabo case in 1992. So that's not too long ago, and we're still wrestling with all of these concepts. Well, that is the crown that we're talking about. So today, when we're, in the year, I think it's actually perfect that we have a coronation in the year that we're also having the Voice to Parliament referendum. That couldn't be better timed, because they juxtapose and contradict each other. And therefore, at the time that we are committing to walk this journey of justice, we've got, a king ordained apparently by God, by someone's God, not all of Australians' God, are saying to us that we should still bend a knee. And this is a crown that has never, despite repeated requests over more than 100 years by First Nations Australians, and I might say many descendants of slaves across all of the Commonwealth, former colonies. But let's talk about First Nations peoples. Repeated requests to account for those historical injustices, something that Australia is already doing. When we saw Kevin Rudd, for example, with the apology, they've repeatedly resisted doing so and have never acknowledged the historical wrongs that were perpetrated against Australia's First Nations peoples. And that's what Charles should be asked to do now and immediately following his coronation.
It feels like we have this conversation about Australia becoming a republic every year, usually around January 26th. It seems, at least to the lay observer, people like myself, that it's never really taken off is the way it feels. Like it's this niche interest of the few, and that most Australians just don't care whether the British monarch is the head of state or not. As one recent report put it, most Australians, when pressed, struggle to remember the name of the current Governor-General, who obviously represents the reigning monarch, or to explain their role. So how do you convince Australians, in particular younger Australians, who right now are most concerned, with the cost of living and their inability to enter the housing market, that we need to change our head of state?
Yeah, great question. The research, again, only in recent weeks, says overwhelmingly that 70% of Australians feel, I would say, understandably, that Charles is unrepresentative of Australia and of our values, and that the majority of Australia want to become a republic as soon as possible. So, we need to acknowledge that, I think. It does periodically spike, if you like. Periodically it becomes more important, and then understandably, these broader, vitally important issues that go to the heart of our nationhood, they do take a back seat because crises happen, wars happen, all sorts of things happen. Cost of living crises happen, that's natural for any country. But there is always a right time to have the conversations, and there is always a right time to make these important moves. And I think that in 2023, as I said before, this broader social movement for Australia to deal with our history finally, and what I think almost all of us acknowledge is a wound at the heart of our national psyche. As we're walking this journey, it's going to make us whole, and it's going to bring us together. It is going to unify us as a people. And the Voice to Parliament is just one part of unification. Actually, what a republic is about is bringing all of the different strands of our history together and the disparate parts into a complete whole.
Thank you, Craig, for coming to Please Explain.
No, my pleasure.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Julia Carr-Katzel. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.
Elise.
And I'm Tom. As Oscar Wilde once said,
ultimately the bond of all companionship, whether in marriage or in friendship, is conversation.
Welcome to our husband-wife podcast, The Elliott Exchange. What could possibly go wrong?
find out with us by tapping the follow or subscribe button on the Elliott Exchange, wherever you get your podcast.